Right, well, welcome all back again for the second of Rowan Williams' Firth Lectures. Everyone enormously enjoyed the first one, which dealt with the religious and anti-religious dimensions of the recent novel and related it to the crisis of perception of religion in our times in a very subtle way. And so we're all very excited that now Rowan is going to do a somewhat parallel job on modern drama. And amongst everything else, Rowan Williams is also a magnificent actor, and his feel for drama is very, very strong indeed. So let's welcome Rowan back again.
Well, there you go. I'm tempted to give you my Shakespeare recitations at this point. Yesterday, we were looking at some of the ways in which religion and the religious identity is perceived and constructed in a variety of modern works of fiction. And today, I want to turn to three recent or fairly recent works of drama. My three examples are these. The first is David Edgar's play, Written on the Heart, which was a high-profile 2011 production by the Royal Shakespeare Company, dealing with the interactions of political power and spiritual integrity around the final revisions to the Bible of 1611. The play contrasts the tormented conscience of the saintly but consumingly ambitious Lancelot Andrewes with the ghostly presence of William Tyndale, martyr and critic of the hierarchy. My second play is from 2006, written by Mick Gordon and no less than A.C. Grayling. The play originally entitled simply On Religion. And it looks at the tensions within a secular family set up by the conversion of one of the characters to Christianity. And not only to Christianity, but to priestly vocation. My third play, also from 2011, is The Faith Machine by Alexei K. Campbell. And that presents within a very complex network of relationships questions about capitalism and personal ethics and the tension within the church between principle and pragmatism. These three dramas, all of them written with no particular theological axe to grind, suggest some of the areas in which religious believing and belonging continue to attract and repel and challenge and baffle our culture. And I want to use these three texts to tease out a bit what it is that still allows aspects of religious and specifically Christian tradition, not to mention in the British context the rather fuzzy residual image of the established church, to work as a creative datum for imaginative life. And I think understanding how that works is part of understanding how theological reflection might feel its way back into a more constructive engagement with public discourse. So let's start with Written on the Heart. This play begins from the problems confronted by the translators of the 1611 King James Bible. How do you render words in Greek and Hebrew whose conventional translations have come to carry heavy theological freight? Faced with the word ecclesia, do you render it church or congregation? With the verb sozein, do you render it heal or save? What about a word which can mean both withdraw or separate yourselves? This is 1611, remember, when separatism is not an academic issue any more than healing and salvation are. There's no innocent or objective version available. The choices you make here are choices which have immediate practical consequences. And to claim that a word means simply what it meant in the original context so that you can strip it of the associations of historical use, is itself an inflammatory political decision. On the other hand, if you look for renderings that minimize offense or allow ambiguity, that too is a political strategy. In 1611, it's a way of saying, thus far and no further, to reform of the Church of England, not academic issues. One Puritan-inclined scholar in the play says, if we render elders priests, in 15 years we may consign the godly to the fire. But this very specific political dilemma is in the play opened up to a wider anxiety about the nature of language and mediation. We see in the rather confusing time shifts of the play, we see a kind of flashback to Tyndale in his prison cell, awaiting execution. A young Catholic priest comes to try to persuade him to think again about his translation and his theological principles. And Tyndale refuses to amend his version because he says it is clear. I must break the glass wherein we see God's face, he says indignantly as the priest challenges him. I must break the glass wherein we see God's face. The original text, rendered in its primitive sense, is a glass in which, or through which, an important distinction, we see God's face. It's transparent to God. And yet, believing this also requires us to think of the text as already written on the heart. We can see through the text to God, because there is in us, ready to be awakened by the written text, the recognition of God's truth. And the meaning of that is already clear to the awakened or reformed heart. And that leaves us with a potentially painful quandary. The text itself is swallowed up in the heart's self-recognition. When the text has done its job, what remains is what is written on the heart. And all difficulty in the text is dissolved by our transparency to ourselves. Tyndale's doubting young Catholic visitor, who later reappears in the play as a Protestant archdeacon, puts it like this. It becomes possible for someone to look into the text and see only difficulty, and to look into the heart and find only emptiness, if there is no community of interpretation around to settle meanings. Tyndale brushes this aside, but the problem recurs in the play. The next time frame which we see in the play is a scene from the Elizabethan period in a parish where there is a spirited quarrel going on about the breaking of painted windows. The image of glass and breaking glass and coloured glass and plain glass runs right through the play. Reformation, say some, means doing away with the faces in the windows that intrude between the heart and the face of God. So instead of images decorating the parish church, you need texts. And such texts, as Tyndale insists in a scene where his ghost returns to confront Lancelot Andrews, such texts must not be muffled by majesty of diction or phrasing. The force of the text, the plain text, is intelligibility to all. Now, Andrews is prompted and prodded, almost tormented by Tyndale, to ask the agonized question of whether, in the light of all this, he is himself without a genuine spiritual witness in his heart. Does he actually see or know or believe anything if the words and the images are taken away? But the play also evokes, very poignantly, the sense of danger that can go with direct, unmediated vision. Lancelot Andrews, in the play, finally backs away from his aspiration to succeed the Archbishop of Canterbury. Wise man. Because he says he does not want to spend his remaining days breaking bones. Ironically, echoing the words of the Puritan parish clerk we've met in the Elizabethan scene, who says that he does not want to spend his life breaking windows for the sake of the Reformation, but to withdraw into a congregation of committed, like-minded believers. I will stay here, says Andrews, in this place, beneath these windows, with the beauty of these words which John tells us were from the beginning. For I would see darkly. I would see darkly. And wanting to see darkly means, for Andrews, alluding of course to 1 Corinthians, not wanting to see the future, not wanting to see the fate of the culture he cares about, not wanting to determine a clarity which is not given to mortals. That's, if you like, the moral and spiritual weight of Andrews's case. Does it also, though, mean that he is afraid to see God face to face? That's the fear that Tyndale has kindled in him, and it's the fear that is left unresolved at the end of the play. The last exchange in the play brings Tyndale back, as Andrews meditates on the translation of the opening words of Genesis. Tyndale prompts him to revisit Coverdale's phrasing, "And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Pause. The sea, a glass in which we see God's face. Tyndale replies, God's face, a glass in which man sees himself. The simple reader of Scripture reads and sees, knows as he is known. And Andrews admits, I would not so see him. But Tyndale replies enigmatically in the play's closing words, with his hand on the folios of translation of the 1611 Bible, "Yet I am still here." It's a fine ending, leaving neatly balanced those two very serious spiritual questions. Is Tyndale, in his insistence on the unmediated, the direct, the glass, God's face, the glass in which we see ourselves, is Tyndale committed to what at the end of the day is a dissolution of all history, all mediation, creation itself, the words of the text standing for all that stands between us and God? Is Tyndale dissolving creation in that direct face-to-face encounter with God? But at the same time, is Andrews backing away from the confrontation with truth, his own truth and God's? Is Andrews' decision to stay beneath these windows with the beauty of these words ultimately evasive? At one level, then, Tyndale's insistence on the text's transparency and its efficacy in making us know ourselves will still survive. I am still here, still survive the attempt to soften the impact of Scripture through the majesty and musicality that Andrews loves. But at another level, the claim to see clearly, to see either God or ourselves clearly, is, as Andrews knows, the root of breaking bones as well as breaking windows. Andrews doesn't want to spend his life breaking bones any more than the Reformer wants to spend his life breaking windows. The fragile work of language, moulded so as to contain rather than intensify contradiction, may be all that we have between us and a wholly chaotic violence. As Andrews earlier on warns the young William Laud, who is indeed to become Archbishop of Canterbury, Laud is already thinking what force might be needed beyond language to enforce conformity. So a text that is received as the unmediated word of God is at the same time almost unimaginably liberating, because in it, at last, as Tyndale says, we can see our own faces, and unbearably and alarmingly volatile in its effects. So rather than offering a direct, unqualified apologia for a culture of the word, the refined and musical word that Andrews loves, the play seems to probe more deeply. Tyndale, with all his unsettling insistence, is still here, even in the heavily mediated, politically and ecclesiastically nuanced solutions that Andrews proposes for translation. Within these words, there is perhaps still the unsettling possibility that we can see God face to face and ourselves too. But Andrews's questions too are weighty enough to be still here. Questions about the danger of imagining that there could be a language valid beyond the limits of temporal existence, a heavenly perfection here on earth, as one of the Puritans in the play says, a free and complete consensus of perception and understanding, a community of the godly and like-minded that doesn't need to listen to anybody except God. And if you listen to God, as is well known, you needn't listen to anybody. It's a play, then, which uses the very idea of a holy, transparent text to ask large questions about language and mediation, about violence and community. The seriousness of Tyndale's presence and challenge in the play has to do with his own passionate desire that everybody should have access to God, and so access to themselves. Hieratic speech accompanies hierarchical authority and distracting visual imagery, and it denies to the powerless person that most basic of powers, the capacity to see and to speak who they are. To see and to speak who they are. The holy text is the unanswerable proclamation that all can have this power, for Tyndale. And the notion of an inspired book which awakens what is latent in everyone is a crucial moment in religious culture. It offers meaning independent of authority, the pivotal point of Enlightenment universalism. And yet that universalism, that direct access to who human beings are, is capable of being a new and yet more troubling tyranny. It can create an absolutism of those who believe that there is nothing to learn in the negotiations of real history. It can mean the rejection of an authoritative past, a tradition, a process of distilling insight, leading to the claim here and now of unchallengeable, transparent reasonableness, and consequently the exclusion from human conversation of all those who don't share that transparent, obvious reasonableness. David Edgar's drama, in short, takes the theological confrontation between tradition and Reformation as a starting point for thinking about the workings of modern language. When meaning is liberated from hierarchical control in the name of universal reason, what follows? What's the price paid in a new kind of division and violence? And Edgar suggests the Bible of 1611 is a sort of icon of this unresolved and unresolvable dilemma. It makes its claim to be the transparent glass in which we see God and ourselves, and yet hedges it round with the awareness of the risks that lie within any rejection of mediation and history. Edgar doesn't quote it, but Bishop Miles Smith's famous preface to the King James Bible, written on behalf of the translators, has some pertinent thoughts on why there can never be a final translation of a text, and how a good translation alerts the reader to the subtleties and differences of meaning. Miles Smith, in the preface on behalf of the translators, is, in other words, saying exactly what the play seems to be driving at, which is that the text itself as we have it, the 1611 Bible, is a very precarious balance between affirming and questioning tradition and mediation. The sacred text both says that meaning is accessible to all and denies that it can be reduced to one moment of transparency and so long as language remains, the glass is in some degree darkened, and that may be a necessary defence against the violence of apocalyptic clarity. Apocalyptic clarity. That's one of the themes in the next play I'd like to look at, which is Alexei K. Campbell's The Faith Machine. This needs a brief summary. Sophie, the moral lodestone of the action, is the daughter of an Anglican bishop, Edward. Edward has resigned his office in protest at the homophobic attitudes and discipline of his church. Sophie separates acrimoniously from her partner, Tom, when Tom accepts an advertising contract with a pharmaceutical company that's been conducting lethally dangerous tests of their products in Africa. She becomes a journalist, making high-risk trips to war zones in Asia, where eventually she is killed. The opening scene depicts the crucial quarrel between Sophie and Tom, and that scene is set with a touch of symbolic overdetermination, typical of the play, on September the 11th, 2001. And in this scene, it's made plain that Sophie is challenging her father's moral intensity in her own ethical passion and her own rejection of a compromised lover. Later in the play, though confusingly it's set chronologically earlier, we see Edward, the bishop, defending his resignation from office to an African colleague. The covert fascist in everyone appreciates clearly defined categories, he says to his African colleague, not those murky shades in between, excoriating the church's obsession with fixing and morally assessing sexual identities and behaviours. But Edward's Kenyan friend, bridling, as you might expect, at the charge of fascism, turns the argument around and accuses Edward of imposing a new colonialism whose main effect will be the destruction of the church in the African context, and of colluding with an uncritical culture of entitlement. It is, says the African, Edward who's the one who can't manage diversity and the actual unsteady pace of historical change. Apocalyptic clarity, it seems, is the enemy of the world as it is. And yet, when you start appealing to the world as it is, you have a problem. Tom, Sophie's compromised boyfriend, appeals to the world as it is to justify his decision to go on working for a corrupt agency. And any appeal to the natural processes of the world and the naturalness of compromise or delay can be a moral alibi. And Tom accuses Sophie of not having lived her life at all because of her obsession with being and doing right. None of us, says Tom, has made the world the way it is. We have to take the slender chances of happiness that we are offered through human love, accepting that the rest is, I leave out the adjectives, the left is atoms, things, animals in the dark, eating each other, appetite, that's all, ruthless and indiscriminate. That's the way the world is. What's most interesting for my concerns in this discussion is that Sophie's renewed challenge to Tom, when she meets him 9 years after their earlier breakup, is prompted by a bit of literary criticism. She's been rereading a novel that the younger Tom wrote and realised that, callow as it was written for a reason. And she's realised also that whatever reason Tom had for writing the novel has long since vanished. Tom's absorption into the world of advertising has, quote, has had something to do with words losing their definitions, their intrinsic meanings. Words like success and happiness and aspiration, believe in better. And that once the words went, then everything else did too, and that things lost their shape, and you weren't able to distinguish what was true from what wasn't, and everything became not about what you were, but about the way you were perceived. Not about what connected you to others, but about what separated you. That passionate speech from Sophie culminates in her accusation that in a world like that, where language has been thinned out, all decisions are weightless. There's nothing to talk about. No word or act truly connects with other speakers or with the world itself. So Sophie identifies the moral crisis of rampant capitalism as a crisis of language. When everything is reduced to its exchange value, its price, words lose their substance. The common world in which we share perception in language and offer perception for possible language we might share, the sense of a common agenda in a world we can understand only in relation and collaboration, all this is what's lost in Tom's world the way it is, the world of animals eating each other. And, it's implied, it's no use thinking of human love as the one worthwhile, non-exchangeable thing in this dystopian environment, because love can't of itself, as the play makes clear, survive without a soil to grow on, in common language, what we interestingly call common decency. Language that struggles with a givenness quite unlike what Tom thinks are the givens of the world. Sophie's not a person of religious faith, but in the last scene, which follows on her death, someone recalls her saying that she is a faith machine. Whatever a Darwinian vision of nature read in Tooth and Claw might suggest, some people, quote, inherited in their machinery something that made them need to believe. Against all empirical evidence, says the character, some, like her, continue to believe in the human being. We've seen her friends, after her death, sorting through her library, occasionally picking out quotations from books. And at one point, the Ukrainian housekeeper reads from Tolstoy, "Become at the fearful price of abnegation what you could be." And she asks significantly, what does abnegation mean? A little later, a young African student, also a friend of Sophie's, Agatha, picks up a King James Bible and quotes to Tom, "What good shall it profit a man shall he gain the whole world?" Sophie's abnegation is difficult, if not incomprehensible, to those around her. But these words and phrases are presented as fragments shored against ruins, the remains of a culture in which it once made sense to speak of sacrifice. At the very end, Agatha, the Ugandan, asks Tom who he really is. He thinks long and hard, says the stage direction, and eventually replies, "The missing man. Let's call me the missing man." The loss of Sophie's language is the loss of a particular kind of human face, we could say. Tom recognizes that his humanity has gone missing, but he's got no obvious resource for recovering himself. He doesn't believe in human being, like Sophie, and there's nothing else to believe in. Now that theme of fractured language, that theme of fractured language has already been flagged up in The Descent into Dementia of Sophie's father, Bishop Edward. He proclaims, "I am life." He comes out with scattered biblical phrases, and he tells Sophie and Tom that he's writing a book and leaving notes for it. Everywhere. Under the bed, in the hole. But when Tom inadvertently comes across one such piece of paper, it's blank. The play's imagery moves steadily towards a concluding picture of a last fragile residue of meaningful language, embodied in Sophie's story and legacy, in her secular library of sacred texts, which are about believing in human being. And that rather artificial scene, where her friends go through her books, is a way of indicating what's formed her own speech and sense. The books are going to go to Agatha. formed in a Bible-reading family in Uganda, at least she knows how to read, or to be read by texts. She's not yet lost the sense that there can be a text that shows you yourself, the kind of text that David Edgar's Tyndale wants to put into the hands of every ploughboy. But the culture inhabited by Tom, the world as it is confronted only by fragments, blank paper, stray words from a demented man. Just as in David Edgar's play, what we see here is a profoundly uncomfortable map of our language. The moral certainties of Edward and Sophie, their apocalyptic clarity, are unsettling, and they're not without their moral shadows. Yet, when they are fractured or dissolved, when their world and their speech disappears, what we're left with is a missing man. Sacred text, here understood less specifically than in Edgar's play, understood as the general moral and imaginative canon represented by Sophie's books, Tolstoy, Kierkegaard, Plato, Neruda, Forster, Shakespeare, is a glass in which we see, if not God's face, at least a human face, a Blakean human form divine, a face that could be ours. But that clarity is not without cost, not just the obvious cost of abnegation, but some kind of cost in terms of a patience with the contingent and the untidy, which neither Edward nor Sophie possess. Sophie's self-description as a faith machine is telling. It's as though faith is indeed a genetic determination, setting some people apart from others, with the result of mutual incomprehension. A bleak play at the end of the day, and I don't think that our introduction towards the end to Sophie's private library of humanist sacred texts really redeems very much in the play. But my third and last example is again about mutual incomprehension, with a slightly different twist. This play, as I've said, was initially entitled On Religion. It didn't take very long to realize that that wasn't necessarily a seat-filling title for a play. And when the play was revived in 2008 in New York, it was retitled, interestingly and significantly, Grace. Tom, a young lawyer, has converted to Christianity and is exploring a vocation to the priesthood, to the horror and dismay of his mother, Grace. Grace is a prominent scientist and anti-religious polemicist, a sort of female Richard Dawkins, we're given to understand. Tom's Jewish father and agnostic girlfriend look on in bemusement as the conflict becomes increasingly bitter between Grace and Tom. Once again, with a slight edge of superfluous melodrama, Tom is killed off. Why do playwrights need to kill their characters quite so promiscuously, one may ask? But Tom dies in a terrorist incident, and that provokes the worst conflict of all. Grace furiously resists the idea of a requiem mass for her son, and so alienates Ruth, Tom's partner. Ruth remembers her own atheist father's funeral, where she says, "We didn't say a word because it wasn't right, because he would have hated it. So we said nothing." And it wasn't enough. It really wasn't. Not nearly. She wants at least to have Philip Larkin's Church-Going read. Grace refuses, and so at the funeral, Ruth reads instead another poem by Philip Larkin, "This Be the Verse." I can see some of you know it. Much later, at Tom's grave, there's a kind of reconciliation as Ruth presses Grace to speak honestly to her dead son, and Grace finally pours out her confusion. When Tom was born, she says, she sensed the center of her being radically moved towards another. She felt her own self-loathing and self-doubt healed. And yet, as Tom has grown up, she's deliberately withdrawn from him so that he will learn that we're on our own, she says. A message, she says, she was never taught. She then painfully acknowledges the splinter in the mind which believes that Tom got what you deserved. You got the poem you were looking for. He has died because of violent and murderous religion, despite his passion to overcome bad religion with good. He has earned this horribly ironic fate. Grace is, of course, intensely ashamed at saying this, but she's articulated what she calls the splinter in the mind, that deep and toxic hostility that allows her to say that Tom has earned his fate. That's what religion does to you. But in saying that, she also acknowledges the inadequacy of her own reasonable vocabulary in the face of the nightmares of actual human experience. All through the play, Tom's inarticulate but deeply felt arguments in favour of faith are verbally contrasted with Grace's carefully phrased, inexorable presentation of the secular case. Anybody who's ever had the experience of arguing in public with Richard Dawkins will know what that feels like. Tom, he says, wants to be an Enlightenment person, but also religious. And Grace insists that's a contradiction and a self-indulgent contradiction. Any form of religious language, he says, provides cover for maniacs and fanatics. But Tom argues that, quote, in the real world, where religion is present everywhere, there's no chance of persuading people to abandon faith. It's as ubiquitous as sex and aggression. The best we can hope, he says, is to refuse the zero-sum game between pure Enlightenment thinking and bad religion. And faith is still worth holding on to, because, like human love, it's more than the list of things. Just as a commitment to another person is not just another conclusion you draw from a bundle of evidence, so God is not a thing among other things, another conclusion you draw from certain kinds of evidence. So for Tom, Christianity is, he says, the language he speaks. Like any language, it can say and show things that others can't. It's possible to hold this is the best language without refusing truth or validity to the others. The problem comes with a language that quantifies everything, that sees the lists of things as the essence of what is to be talked about. That's why Tom says in exasperation, Grace is the real fundamentalist in this context. So the question posed by the debates in this play have to do with whether any attempt to formalise a language for what's not being said at Ruth's father's funeral is going to be implicitly or incipiently a cover for apocalyptic certainty of the worst kind. All right, you might say, something is missing. But supplying words for that missing something starts off the whole murderous business of dogmatism and rivalry. Ruth, in some ways one of the most sympathetic figures in the play, Tom's girlfriend, Ruth knows there is something missing and equally believes that she knows that to supply it is the beginning of the end. Like the other dramas we've been looking at, On Religion, or Grace, doesn't offer any resolution. The shocking, I'd say melodramatic, death of Tom at the hands of religious fanatics may be too facile an irony, though it allows Grace a powerful monologue, as it were acknowledging the excessiveness of that irony. But she comes close to acknowledging her own apocalyptic clarity, while at the same time recognizing the excess at the center of her personal response, both to gift and to loss, recognizing how she is moved away from her center, both in the experience of giving birth and in the experience of grieving for her dead son. There is a very palpable strain in her attempt to speak to her dead son, but she becomes increasingly direct as she becomes increasingly agitated at Tom's grave. Ruth asks her with affectionate mockery, "Who are you talking to, you mad woman?" It's as though this is the only language possible for the excess of feeling that Grace finally recognizes, the excess of feeling over the list of things. She addresses her absent son in the context of consecrated ground, a serious place for serious people, as Grace says in ironic homage to Larkin. And the implication is perhaps that if religious language is ever to find a place as something other than a potentially dangerous ideology, it's got to be in this register, the unreasonable, counterfactual address to what is absent, rather than anything that has a descriptive claim. We're very properly left unclear as to whether this is the language for which Tom has been willing to sacrifice career and even family, or whether, if it isn't, it's really just the same as the language of the fundamentalists who kill him. We're left unclear as to whether it can count as the sort of commitment briefly evoked at the very end of the play, when Tom's father, Tony, gives Ruth the paper napkin on which Tom once wrote his reasons for and against marrying Ruth. The process he'd once described to Ruth so as to show why that list could never add up to what I was about to do. And that imagery of something in our practice of language that never adds up to the conclusion we actually draw or the act we actually perform is the hook on which the possibility of religious language is left hanging rather uncertainly at the end of this play. Well, at the surface level, all these three dramas show, among other things, more than a touch of secular nostalgia. A recognition that religious language allows a dimension of human identity and human accountability to be articulated. When it's lost, something real is lost. None of the plays is written from the point of view of faith, and none is simply hostile to that point of view, though the nexus of religion and violence is, as you've seen, constantly invoked. But what's intriguing is the way in which the cultural memory of religion, the immediate memory of a religious upbringing in the faith machine, functions as a vehicle for anxieties about how to do justice in human speech to certain elements in our humanity. Very roughly speaking, the plays prompt the question of whether there is a language which allows us a measure of self-transparency that will liberate us from the self-images variously imposed on us, the world as it is. If human speech can't ever do this, are we just left with the world as it is, with the weightlessness of Tom in the faith machine, or the ultimately oppressive and self-oppressive rational individualism of Grace, conscientiously burying her intuition in giving birth that her ego has been recentered and deliberately inducting her child into a world where we're on our own. The secular nostalgia is for a world in which there is somewhere, somehow, a text which speaks truthfully about who we are and can be recognized by us as such, written on the heart. But these are also dramas that carefully warn about the risks of committing to any particular claimant to such a status. It's as if what's lost by commitment is some kind of appropriate irony, some sort of humility even, a proper caution about final clarity, because clarity must be apocalyptic and therefore violent. Critical reception of all these plays was uneven. A good deal of respect in some quarters for the substantial questions raised, a good deal of exasperation in others at the excessively didactic tone of them, and especially in the faith machine, what was seen as priggishness in some characters. As I've hinted, the deaths of Sophie and of Tom are open to the accusation of melodrama, and the post-mortem trawl through Sophie's books is a transparent excuse for a sentimental review of one kind of ethical literary canon, a great books course for the wistful humanist. All three plays make high demands on the audience in their cross-cutting of sequences, in the long expository speeches and arguments that they include. But the more unsympathetic critics were overlooking some of the deeper consistencies in each play. And most particularly, I've been suggesting, they've been overlooking their concern with what language itself can and can't do in a secular environment. But I suppose it's that concern that's of most interest for anyone reflecting on the frontier between religious belief and the world of literary imagination. All three of them see it as a serious question. What can language do in a secular culture? Looking at this frontier is not a matter of seeking religious residues or coded reminiscences of faith or theological patterning in ostensibly secular texts. It's attending to the issue that's so insistently pressed in these plays. What are we prohibited from saying by a thoroughgoing secular worldview? What do we lose? What's missing? And why is the resultant discourse not nearly enough, in Ruth's words about her father's funeral? Now, the plays maintain a precarious balance, recognizing the fact of moral loss, yet putting all the imaginative arguments very forcefully against actual commitment. Yet the theologian, looking at these plays, might want to raise a number of points about how religious language is being characterized. Let's say, for example, that the hints at the end of the On Religion play could be systematized like this. There is a role for religious speech as the simple performance of unmanageable emotion in language. But there's no role for a third-person discourse about realities that might justify the use of such language. As soon as we attempt to justify, we are on the road to covert or overt fascism, as Grace argues, and Edward also. A claim that the world is thus and not otherwise, which would in turn justify the exclusion or annihilation of those who don't talk like this. But this leaves religious language with no real work to do as a shared reality. If it's just about performing unmanageable emotion in speech, in what sense is it a common enterprise? And if it doesn't operate as a common enterprise, how can it effectively work against the world as it is, Tom's world? It'll relate only to what the individual senses can't be spoken. It'll be an expression precisely of the kind of nostalgia that this kind of secularity invites. If only we could speak in relation to a frame of reference that is not the world as it is, if only we could construct a world in the process of exploring speech together. But what would make such construction possible would be acknowledging that we are dealing with a common question, a common moral challenge. Yes, a humanity that can be uncovered in any human being, as Tyndale believes, if there is some word that brings it alive, something written on the heart that can be kindled by sacred speech. And here's the crucial point at which the resources of traditional theological speech can be deployed to respond to the anxiety that keeps surfacing. The anxiety that if we refer to a shared world of more dimensions than the world as it is, we'll just be pushed towards violence and exclusion. If there is a communication whose source is outside the world of determinate agencies and objects, granted the inadequacy of the word outside there, it's by definition beyond the ownership of any speaker or group of speakers. It'll always, however authoritatively defined for the time being, invite further thought, further speech. as we've seen Miles Smith arguing in his preface to the King James Bible, it will always be capable of fresh translation. And that endless translatability is one of the things that stops it freezing in oppressive or exclusive form. The history of revealed religion is full to overflowing of distortions of this in the name of whatever authority currently prevails. But the fact is that just such a process of translation has characterized the history of revealed religion. It's never simply led to an abandonment of the conviction that there has been provided a glass in which to see the human and the divine face. But Lancelot Andrews's seeing darkly need not be an agnostic aestheticism turned in on itself, not just a stark alternative to Tyndale's confident hope for a universally shared human self-understanding. What makes the difference is the continuing fact of corporate religious discerning, shared religious argument and practice. Not only corporate worship, including corporate and personal silence, but all the reflection that flows from it. Conclusion then. Between innocent speech, free from any risk of violent distortion, and nakedly ideological speech, obviously a bad thing, defined by its claim to power, there is, the theologian would have to claim, something else. These three plays reflect an uneasy, perhaps half-conscious suspicion that clarity about the human condition is as much of a problem as total confusion about it. So that a speech which claims to set out a coherent picture of human destiny or nature or vocation is always already so compromised, so ideological or violent, that it can't be accepted or committed to. But what if that speech is also a way both of recalling speakers to an ultimate reticence or humility before what is spoken of, and a way of finding access to a resource of grace or absolution in the wake of inevitable failure? If that is a dimension of traditional and corporate religious speech, it can't be written off in advance as irredeemably violent. In that context, the transparency to self and God that's involved becomes not a triumphant comprehension, a successful map of the territory, but a series of keys to recognition. A text which speaks like this will be one that allows enough partial recognition at a time to enlarge the scope of self-awareness and self-questioning in a way that opens up new levels of recognition, a new readiness to seek patiently what's recognizable in the speech of others. Geoffrey Hill wrote in an early-ish essay of what he called the necessary formal alienation that belongs to serious poetry. A good poem is alien in the sense that it leaves the reader feeling as though brushed past or aside by an alien being. A very powerful image of how poetry works. In the poem, says Hill, something has come to itself more fully than the reader has, and so exerts an authority which can be resented or ignored or welcomed or fought, an authority in putting the reader's world in question. In looking at these three plays, we've been concentrating on the unease that surrounds the alien, that which is more realized in itself than we are, the majority of the readers. And religious language has this in common with poetry, that it's ultimately not about what an audience has requested, but proposes or verbally embodies a world of relations and obligations we haven't chosen. But what distinguishes religious speech, even from most poetry, is the affirmation that this world of relation and obligation is also an effective source of absolution or healing, once we've acknowledged the loss or damage we bring to it and inflict upon it. So if there are general lessons to be learned here for the study of religion and literature, they have to do with how theology educates us as readers in the widest sense. We were thinking yesterday about how certain kinds of novel, by helping us to inhabit the position of faith, allow us precisely to read our own sense of self in new ways. We've been looking at these dramatic texts at the different ways in which characters read and are read, the different kinds of transparency that are life-giving or death-dealing. We're looking at that difficult frontier where the world of unchosen relation and obligation, as I've called it, impinges on the world as it is. These plays don't attempt to soften that confrontation. They don't attempt to suggest that there is a simple theological way of getting through it and putting the questions behind us. But they do help us to see that nostalgia for lost moral connections isn't quite enough. Its forms and expressions, though, are suggestive. If there is a missing man in contemporary literature, we should bear in mind that missing things are things that are supposed to belong. It's not just a narrowly religious paradox that it seems to be the most alien speech that can restore to us something of that most durable belonging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rowan, very much indeed for another truly absorbing lecture. And I think it's interesting that these more secular dramatic texts proved just as fascinating and fruitful as the slightly more committed novels you were talking about yesterday. I'd like to kick it off by asking you perhaps to say a little more about the relationship between a kind of extreme religious, revelatory, voluntarist non-mediation on the one hand, and a more rationalistic non-mediation on the other hand. And I think it's interesting that possibly within English and Anglican sensibilities, you can see a certain mutation with people like Hobbes, Boyle, maybe Jeremy Taylor, John Locke. You can see how voluntarism and rationalism belong together, and the one turns into the other. And I think it's more than significant that, as you know, Deborah Sugar points out, but this argument about language undergoes an astonishing reversal after 1660. It starts to be the Puritans who insist on metaphorically rich, mediating kind of language in the face of a kind of, post-metaphysical poetry insistence on, plain speech by kind of mainline Protestantism. And I'm sort of wondering about the implications of all that. And I'm also wondering whether, sometimes kind of the early modern forms of, particularly Counter-Reformation forms, insistence on mediation, are sort of complicit with what they're opposing, insofar as they've sort of lost the participatory. It's as if they're saying somewhere there is a pure unmediated, and we just, as a matter of fact, circumstance, need these very authoritative mediations. And instead of the paradox, the immediate can be mediated. And in a sense, for Christianity, doesn't that paradox go all the way up? It would be an illusion to imagine that even in the beatific vision, where we see through the created divine light, we've gone beyond mediation. And indeed, the Christian vision of God is that there is mediation in God, or it parallels the way in which, in Plato, there is participation amongst the forms. And if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have relationality and freedom and difference in the absolute. And so maybe there's a danger in the early modern in sort of losing sight of all that, although I think not at all. In maybe one of the virtues of Anglicanism and Lancelot Andrews and people is that they don't lose sight of that, and they're in a way that makes them much more Catholic than the Catholics, in a way, if I can be provocative. But I think that, you know, there are exceptions to that. But I don't know whether you'd like to comment on those points. Yeah.
I would indeed, yes. In all sorts of ways, but let's start with one particular point. I think the positive affirmation of mediation is in effect to say we always know, speak, sense, whatever, through the other. We don't simply confront a diametrically opposite other registering in a dual relationship. We know what's in front of us sideways, backwards, mediatedly. That's what it is for us to speak, to know. Yeah. And that theological point, I think, is a fundamental one, something to do with the Trinitarian image at the end of the day. That's another story. And I think you're quite right to say one of the problems in, let's say, Baroque religious imagery of a certain kind is exactly that absolute disjunction between the world of representation, which is in some ways arbitrarily extendable. You can do it like add the extra frills. It's all in good cause because it's not what you're talking about.
Yeah, so that is aesthetic fascism in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, of course, is exactly the point that Walter Benjamin makes about Baroque religious drama. That it's the drama of an absent God. Absolutely. And so I think that's certainly part of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
My point is just a comment on the three plays, very sophomore. But I was thinking that, to me, talk about uncertainty. And for me, it seems that impossibility has to be the first order, and then uncertainty is a second order. And the reason I say that is because if we take the Tyndale and Andrews scenario, both contradict themselves, at least in two regards as I can see it. If we take Tyndale, he has to see the words to read them. So there's still mediation there. And then the second irony is he keeps appearing as a ghost, an apparition. So he's a saint. He's a mediator delivering a message, an angel. So again, he's mediating. And then with Andrews, if that's his name, it's interesting about him. Tyndale remains for him, it seems to me, in two ways. First of all, it's the text that he read in Hebrew and Greek that makes him desist or resist the temptation of utter clarity. And also, so it's a truth that he's read that makes him not do it. So that's Tyndale again, reminding him. And then second, he chose to translate this text rather than that text. So again, Tyndale remains, the truth remains. And that brings me to the faith machine, where I think someone said, oh, some people are wired to believe, or something like that. But that's a beautifully contradictory sentence. That person is wired to believe in people. So why should we talk about faith machine is someone who is religious being wired to believe. The humanist is equally wired to believe in people. And that's why you can talk about the human machine, the science machine, or the reason machine. And this leads me to the last point, when you talk about the blank paper, I wonder, are we fooled by that? And maybe just like if we use machine, faith, reason, person, whatever, it's just the machine that is wired in some way or other. If it is the machine all the way down, maybe all paper is blank and language is evacuated of all content, and therefore we have this residing abyss in that sense.
Thank you. Just to connect two bits of what you were saying there, that last point, all paper is blank, I think that is the logical extrapolation of the mechanical image. There can't be texts if the machine is, so to speak, the only text. There's only program, not text, put it that way. But that is what I was trying to say was one of the dangers in Tyndale's position, or one of the unexamined instabilities in Tyndale's position, that when the heart recognizes, the text vanishes. The heart does its job and responds to the truth, and the text falls away. So Tyndale's commitment to the abiding significance of text and of history, therefore, is rendered difficult by that emphasis on what's written on the heart. And I think it's what David Edgar is doing in the play is probably making Tyndale a great deal more modern than the real Tyndale would have been, in precisely that text dissolving spirit. But that's just a thought in response to the question. Someone in the front here? Lady here.
Thank you very much. I feel prompted today to play a little bit devil's advocate, but at the same time, perhaps to try and reconcile something. When in your first incident of talking, I felt very much drawn to ask, isn't that the kind of language Bonhoeffer would turn in his grave about? And it came back to me again when you were talking. But this is me talking, and I'm not an eminent theologian, I'm a practical theologian. That bit of research I have done about insight and the spark that Lonergan talks about. Why I'm saying I think I'm maybe trying to reconcile something with itself is Rowan Williams, I took off my hat and I never put it back on after I heard you speak on radio when you were interviewed about being in New York on 9/11. And the presenter was asking you, didn't that challenge your faith? And you simply replied, God is still in the midst of that doesn't change. For me, that is reconciling something with itself that seems to be missing in all this talk about mediation and language here, because you're engaging with the painful reality in saying that. You're saying it very clearly. There is some embodied speech, and you're engaging and you're transcending the painful reality. And it seems to me, from my little tenuous grasp of what we're talking about here, that maybe, if you're right, and I'm sure you are as a scholar, that Bonhoeffer leaves some room open for a new kind of religious language, then that's what it's got to be. And that may be found, and I think you were talking about that yesterday, that may be found in secular humanistic language or in a scientist language, when Albert Einstein says, I'm quite content with the mystery of reality. For me, in my perhaps naive and tenuous grasp of things, there is more of faith than in a lot of discourse about mediation. I think I stopped there.
Thank you. I think that what I'd want to hang on to, though, is that, picking up what John was saying right at the start, it's not as if even when the believer is searching for a new idiom, a new perspective, the believer is just coming directly at the mystery. There's always that relation to the speech, the perception of another, the contemporary other, the non-religious other, just as to the other who is represented in tradition and history. So that I am always engaged in conversation, in listening and speaking before perception. That's what I want to hang on to, rather than simply buy into what can be a rather problematic sense that I, as the individual, just see into what's there and speak out of that. I want to give a role to mediation in that sense, certainly. And that opens out into some other things too. And well, I'll leave it there too.
Yeah. There was somebody in the front.
It's here, I think.
Come in. There you are.
Actually builds on what... can anyone hear me? Yeah. Builds on what this lady said. Sorry, I was interested to hear you mention A.C. Grayling. And he's one of his recent publications was very arrogantly... I think he's compiled a lot of passages from literature.
Oh, The Good Book.
The Good Book,
yes,
a secular Bible.
Yes.
That seems to me a very arrogant and heavy-handed way of saying that we don't need religion, we've got literature. And I think he's wrong in that, but he's made the argument, and it's been made by other people a lot more elegantly. I don't have as much of a religious background as a literary background, so although I don't like his methods, I can see where he's coming from. I just wonder if you've got a few words on that yourself?
Yes. I did actually do a discussion with him on the Good Book a few years ago, and one of the questions I put was, so here's this text, this kind of secular Bible, an anthology of all the sort of things that you find inspiring. But the Bible is not an anthology of things we find inspiring. The Bible is the deposit of a particular community struggling its way through a set of specific historical circumstances and hammering out its language about God together in the light of sensing or confronting the word of God coming through that history. Now, the Good Book is just an anthology, and therefore it reflects one person's account of what's moving and inspiring, and that's fine. But it's not how Scripture works, because Scripture is read in a community as the work of a community, both in the sense of coming from a community and addressing a community. And I couldn't see this anthology being read on Sundays or Saturdays in assemblies in the same way, or provoking the same kind of sense of head-battering difficulty that the Bible occasionally gives and constructively gives. So I think that's what the Bible as literature, or literature as the Bible, can't quite deliver. It's the grainy specifics of a history, which is not to say there's not a lot of wonderful stuff in Grayling's anthology, which I respond to very warmly. But I think it is odd that if you're going to construct an anthology of what is, if you like, the supreme example of humanist imagination and intelligence, the one thing you conspicuously leave out at every turn is religion. Yeah. So you end up with texts that are less than themselves because they've been edited to make it clear that they're supposed to be non-religious. That's the point at which I get a bit troubled.
There's a lady back here.
Thank you. I've been enjoying your lectures and this debate a lot. My question is to press you a little more. Yesterday you spoke a lot more about it than perhaps today, but it's inherent in drama, which is the place of irony as a literary concept and perhaps a theological one in terms of working through your argument. The personal reason I ask this is because I'm rereading Middlemarch at the moment, and it struck me in everything that you've been saying that the character of Dorothea Brooke is a very interesting character, as we all probably know, about thinking through ideas about spiritual and religious belief. And it strikes me that at the beginning of the novel, she's possibly the least ironic character in English literary history. And she learns, as part of her intellectual and moral maturity, to find irony and to use irony in ways which we might interpret as very sad, perhaps even tragic, but also something deep about that. And it made me think about what you were saying yesterday about the price of seriousness and sanity. And also irony perhaps as a way of connecting to what you were saying today as a midway between clarity and confusion. And just to add to all of this, it strikes me sometimes that in popular culture, everything is so ironized now that there is no space for real thinking about a serious, more interesting, more reflective kind of irony.
That's a wonderful set of points, thank you. And I'd love to talk at length about this, but I'll try and spare you. So one or two comments briefly. To your last point about the prevalence of irony, I suspect that more than suspect, I believe, that when irony is all pervasive, irony becomes impossible. As if everything is ironical, nothing is. The point about irony is that there is a jarring disjunction between what I represent myself as being or am represented as being, and what is being represented. And that disjunction may be a source of wit, of insight, of humility, even of charity. And I think within a variety of literary contexts, those are some of the ways in which irony works, but it only works because there is, ironically, a sense of what's not ironizable within it. So I think that's where I'd start in responding. I warm very much to what you say about Middlemarch, and I think that where Dorothea ends is precisely in a sense of potentially, we don't quite know, potentially tragic disjunction. This is who she thought she was, this is who she's become, this is who she thinks she might be, and the plates grind. And in that grinding, something not wholly destructive or absurd is happening. Yeah, a lot more to say, but I'm very grateful for that. I don't know if you know Jonathan Lear's work on irony, but that's, to me, a very, very good and fertile recent discussion. It has helped me a lot. There's somebody in front here.
Let's give you both a very quick question. Get round to answer. Quick answer this time round.
Well, picking up your remarks about the melodrama in the two of the plays, and to an extent the irresolution in one of the plays, I wanted to invite you to reflect as a reader and as a writer about the different constraints of different genres in allowing religious language, or even just allowing the integrity of language.
Right. So, Jŷrgen, quickly.
It sounded to me as if you hadn't done it very well.
Yes. My question is about the last of your plays, Grace. Is it not the case that this mutual incomprehension that you talked about is both produced and perhaps sustained by the unintelligibility of Tom's conversion to Christianity? And why do you think it is the case, or maybe you don't think it's the case, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to narrate or depict religious conversion as something other than just a brute fact in contemporary culture?
Thank you. Not unrelated, actually, to the earlier question. I think you're right. Tom's conversion is presented to us as almost entirely arbitrary, and his defense of it is constantly embarrassed and awkward in a very plausible and humanly credible way. But it takes us back a little bit to some of the discussion we were having yesterday, doesn't it, about, or no, it's not, it's this morning, about what credible religious autobiography looks like in a contemporary setting. How we might display a narrative that wasn't just a history of opinions, but making some sense, some story of a journey towards that point. And that, I think, is where I want to come back to your very interesting question about what's possible in the genre. I think it's really quite important that there should be religiously grounded or informed drama that resists easy closures, that resists bringing in conversion as happy ending. I think one of the interesting things that at least some Christian novelists of the last century or so have done is to leave helpful unfinished business there. I think Iris Murdoch at her best can do that, at her best. I suppose my worry about the melodrama is that it does feel precisely as a bit of a strain with the genre. These are plays of relatively domestic argument and interaction, and suddenly we're hit on the head with geopolitical hammers in a way which I just find slightly odd. Now, on religion, grace, whatever, Tom's death at the hands of terrorists allows precisely for that awful moment of grace saying, well, he found the poem he was looking for. And that almost justifies it. I'm not so sure with The Faith Machine. But the genre question is a good one. It does, I think, take us back again to something we were talking about this morning, the way in which some bits of biblical narrative very, very visibly step back from being explicit about the involvement of God. Whether it's the story of Joseph in Genesis or the book of Esther or whatever. And there is an important thing that the religious person crafting narrative, poetry or whatever, needs, as Maritain, Flannery O'Connor and all these other people say, needs to observe the kind of thing that's being made. And the kind of thing that's being made can be wrecked by introducing a deus ex machina of some kind.
Well, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. So it just remains for me to give the final thanks, and first of all to Tom O'Loughlin for being such a wonderful master of ceremonies, and secondly, and most of all, to Rowan himself for giving so lavishly of his time and energy and intellect and wit during these 2 days in the midst of a phenomenally busy retirement from the top. Thank you very much, Rowan. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.